Okay, welcome everyone to our lecture on periodization. We've had a lot of different variables that we've discussed during this class, but I feel that it has to tie together. It all has to tie together. And how is that done? It's how you periodize your training. So one of the things that I want you to have gotten out of this course is question things, right? One of the things is when I come into the classroom, I'm not necessarily the authority. The data is the authority. And that's what I've tried to get across is I may have a good feel for the data, but ultimately the data is the authority. Think objectively and use science as a guide to optimizing your performance, right? And let's stay away from bro science, right? So one of the questions we should ask is not does this work, but rather we should pose the more important provoking question, is this optimal? And do we know what's optimal? No. But what we can tell you is what science indicates is closest to optimal at this point. And periodization is one of the major keys to that. So the origins of periodization is that it was originally used to describe photoperiods of the sun in the 20s. In fact, coaches noticed that athletes play better in the summer months than the winter months. And so Meng proposed that annual biorhythms govern greater activity in the summer than the winter months. But it's very likely that what was really happening is that food was better in the summer than the winter months, and so athletes perform better. The real science of periodization started in the 50s with European athletes. And because they couldn't just go to Gold's Gym. They couldn't go to Powerhouse. They couldn't go to 24 Hour Fitness or McNiff. Those resources weren't around. So what they did was athletes would leave home and train for months at a time at training camps. And of course, training with the same competitors over and over again, being away from family, became difficult and they became stale. So when they noticed athletes got stale, they'd move them to another training facility and they'd notice that all of a sudden their performance went up. And what happens when you change a training facility, that's an introduction of variation into the environment. So what the European countries asked was, what is it about variation that triggers adaptation? And that's where the science of periodization came about. So periodization has been suggested to be the laws that govern training. But in short, it's changing loading patterns and program variation and rest. So what you're doing basically, the key is it is programmed variation, programmed change and rest, ultimately to reach a physiological fitness peak. Now, so the point is, it's not, I'm going to go in, I wonder what I'm going to train today. Maybe I'll just do like supersets. That could be variation, but it's not programmed. So periodization is planned variation. Programmed rest. The model itself is based on Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. And Hans Selye model says that essentially when we go in to train, we have an overload. This is our performance. Initially, our performance goes down, right? So if you can run a 6-minute mile and you run 3 miles hard, you might only be able to run a 6.5-minute mile, so your performance goes down. If you could bench press 10 reps with 225 on the first set, by the 10th set you might only be able to bench 3. Now the thing is though, while you're training, your adrenaline goes up, right? You get sort of amped up, and that's why he called this the alarm reaction phase. So it's the initial stimulus leads to a decline in performance, and you have a fight or flight response. After that, you adapt. You adapt specifically to the imposed demands. If you train for hypertrophy, you get muscle growth. If you train for strength, it'd be neural. If you train for endurance, those are endurance adaptations. He called this the stage of resistance. And what every athlete can't stand is hitting a plateau. Now, plateau can be caused by two things. And he called the plateau a stage of exhaustion. One, you don't have enough rest, and so you plateau because you're overreached. But if you tapered, you'd rebound. Another reason you might hit a plateau is because you're not changing it up enough. According to the biological law of accommodation, a biological object, in this case a human's response to a given training stimulus, if that training stimulus remains unaltered, decreases over time. So basically what's going on is if you don't change a training stimulus, you don't enter the alarm reaction phase, and therefore you don't enter the stage of resistance. So this means that you have to plan rest to avoid plateau, and you have to plan variation so you can keep going to the alarm reaction and stage of resistance phases. So that is his theory. And we see each of these stages here. You can read on your PowerPoint. The next theory for periodization is sequencing theory. And the first part of that is specificity of fatigue. And that suggests that fatigue is specific to the exercises or modalities used during a training session. Okay, so for example, this tells us how we should sequence our workouts. For example, I shouldn't go into a workout and do back and do biceps before back, because my arms will hinder my ability to lift heavier weights with my back. Also, if I'm going to train legs tomorrow and do squats, I probably shouldn't do a lot of low back workout today. It's going to impair my ability to lift heavy on legs tomorrow. So that's specificity of fatigue, which underlies sequencing theory. And the second part is successive potentiation, which basically says that we should seek to potentiate, not just not interfere, but one workout should potentiate the next. Right? And that's essential. One workout should potentiate the next. For example, you might spend a month first building up, or a cycle should potentiate the next. So you might spend a month building up muscle in your chest and shoulder muscles to train for hypertrophy before emphasizing strength. So if we were to divide a training cycle up, a whole entire year of training or a whole athletic season, we call a macro cycle. You're going to divide that in 1 to 3 month periods, which we would call mesocycles. And in those mesocycles, you're typically focusing on a specific attribute, whether it's strength, power, or hypertrophy, or endurance. Then every week, your week training cycle is going to be a microcycle. And of course, you have a training day, which is all training sessions within a given 24-hour period. Now, this is the original training model. It's called traditional periodization. Notice you start off on a preparatory period where basically your volume is very high and intensity is moderate to low. You're conditioning yourself, building up endurance, trying to lower body fat. Then you have a transition period where basically it's moderate volume, moderate intensity. Then as you move toward peaking, your intensity is maximized, your volume's low, so you can get rid of fatigue. And then you have a transition period between seasons. This is what it looks like. Typically, that first phase is called either a preparatory phase or a hypertrophy phase. If you're a strength athlete, it's a hypertrophy phase. If you're more like an athlete who's playing soccer, it'd be more like a conditioning or a preparatory phase. But basically, you're trying to you're trying to condition the muscles. You're trying to condition the body to be able to take a beating. You're trying to lower body fat percentage. So repetitions are higher, like 8 to 12 reps. Rest is short, like 30 to 90 seconds, and volume is high. In the strength phase, we start to add in 1 to 5 repetitions at greater than 85% or 1 RM, and volume's moderate. During the strength power phase, you increase the intensity from 1 to 3 reps, greater than 90% of your 1 RM, and you throw in power days, which is 40 to 60% of your 1 RM. Volume here is low. And the lowest volume, we're emphasizing maximal strength, maximal power, and you're lowering your volume according to how much fatigue you have. That's a peaking phase. So bottom line is that increased hypertrophy and conditioning is related to strength, which is related to power. But you can't train them all at once or you won't be good at any. And so due to importance, you want to utilize a periodized program to sort of balance your goals. There's 2 types of periodization, linear and undulating, or nonlinear. Linear is traditional, which is a model I just showed you. Undulating is another model which I'll describe later. So applying to sport, off-season would be hypertrophy/conditioning, preseason would be strength, in-season strength power, playoffs or major tournament, peaking phase or taper. And again, this is what it looks like traditionally. So does linear or traditional periodization work? Well, let's talk about the findings on that. So this is traditional periodization, and basically what we see here this is Darren Willoughby did this study. He had one group which was just not periodized, so they did 5 by 10 RM for 16 weeks straight. Group 2 was 6 by 8 RM for 16 weeks straight. And group 3 was periodized, 4 weeks at 5 by 10, 4 weeks at 6 by 8, 3 weeks at 3 by 6, 4 weeks at 3 by 4. So if you look what happened is, this is group 1, 5 by 10, this is group 2, 6 by 8, this is group 3, periodized. That's just the control group. The control group made no gains. From week 0 to 4, all groups made the same gains. But then, groups 1 and 2 who didn't periodize plateaued out. That looks like the stage of exhaustion and is likely caused by a lack of variation. Whereas group 3 went up every single time. And that's the point, because they didn't accommodate, so they were moving back and forth between the alarm reaction and the stage of resistance. This group went from alarm reaction, stage of resistance, stage of exhaustion. So positive mechanism allows for more variation than non-traditional periodization, but the limitations is it may lead to overtraining or loss of adaptation due to extended time in one phase. Conclusion, linear yields greater gains in non-periodized training. Now, in non-traditional, one of the problems is that if you're very highly trained, it's harder to maintain things. So if you go through 1 month conditioning cycle, then you do 1 to 3 months of strength and 1 to 3 months of power, by the time you're done with the power phase, you've lost all your conditioning effects. And that's one of the downsides to this program. The other thing is, if you have to train for strength for 1 to 3 months straight, that could be very taxing on your system. It could lead to injury and overreaching and possibly overtraining. So one way to counter this is the non-traditional model. Non-traditional, you're changing it up every week or every day. And you can see, so the volume and intensity undulate faster. So you have weekly undulating alterations every week, or daily undulating alterations each training session. So this is one of the classic studies done by Buford. And we look at 1 RM leg press. They had a linear periodization, which means they changed it up every 3 weeks. Daily, they changed it up every day. And weekly, they changed it up every week. This leg press strength, notice they all went up equally. So we would conclude for the Buford study that it doesn't matter how you periodize as long as you periodize. However, you need to look at the population. Okay? If you go back to the Willoughby study, he used active college males, which are novice individuals. They're not well trained. Okay? In this study, they were recreationally trained, meaning, again, they were not well trained. And you can see that. Their bench press was around 135 starting to 150. So Monteiro, out of Carlos Ugrinowicz's lab, was the first person to really test this in a highly trained model, or was one of the first people to test this in a highly trained model. And he took very well trained individuals. He had a non-periodized, a linear, and a non-linear, or traditional and non-traditional. They're changing it every day. They're changing it here every 4 weeks. So if you look from week 0 to week 4, the non-periodized made no gains. They immediately entered into the stage of exhaustion because they're well trained enough to where they need variation immediately. Then you can sort of see here, the linear group made a little bit of gains and kind of plateaued off. That's this light gray here. The dark gray group is a group that changed it every day. They made gains from week 0 to 4 to 8 to 12. Okay? And that, so again, you have non-periodized, traditional, non-traditional. So what it suggests is that in athletes, you need to vary it up more often. This is supported by Matt Ray's data in athletes, where he did nonlinear versus traditional, or nonlinear or nonlinear or non-traditional versus traditional or linear. Notice that the ones who change it every day got double the gains in strength, or double the gains in strength, 55% increased leg press versus 28%, and greater bench press strength, 25 versus 14. So now we know if you're an athlete, you need to periodize more frequently, like every day or every week. One question we have is, what's the ideal order? The traditional model, you would do Monday hypertrophy, Wednesday strength, Friday power, because that's the traditional model. Remember, 1 month you might do conditioning, next month strength, next month power. So that's how they've done it in the non-traditional model. Monday, Wednesday, Friday is hypertrophy, strength, power, respectively. One of the things to realize, though, is going back to that sequencing of fatigue thing. So if you train, for example, for power, this is looking at strength, force. Force only goes down a little bit after a power workout and then rebounds back up. Strength goes down and then takes a while to come back up, and hypertrophy has the most fatigue, and that takes a long time to come back up. So basically what it means is that if you were to train for hypertrophy Monday and then go train for strength on Wednesday, you might still be sore, your strength might still be low, and your strength wouldn't be ideal. But if you were trained for hypertrophy Monday and then power Wednesday, by the time you get to Friday, you'd be where you want to be. So this is a study we did. We did hypertrophy day 1, strength day 2, or power day 3, or we did daily undulated, where we did hypertrophy day 1, power day 2, strength day 3. If you look at the totals from bench, squat, and deadlift, they were both the same. This group went up, the hypertrophy and then strength power, but the group that did hypertrophy, power, strength, they went up more. So it looks like you should do power in between. Now, if your goals, that's exactly right. Last thing, we keep talking about changing the loads. What about changing the exercises? No one talks about this. And surprisingly, there's only been one study. And so what we did in this study was we had these two groups. We had constant intensity and constant exercise. So they didn't vary at all, kept the same intensity, same exercise. So for example, weeks 1 through 4, squats 4x8, squats 6x8, and then the last weeks 9 through 12, squats 9x8. Whereas the constant intensity, varying the exercises, squat 2x8, leg press 2x8. Kept the squats 3x8, deadlift 3x8. Kept the squats 3x8, deadlifts, and lunge. So they varied the exercise behind the criterion lift. What happened was the constant exercise did not gain as much strength as the variable exercise. So changing the exercises becomes important as well. Now, future directions, it's all about specificity. Your daily undulated periodization should be tailored toward an athlete's specific goals, whether you're a power lifter, a bodybuilder, a football player, or soccer player, right? So, for example, if you're a power lifter, you might do 2 strength days for every 1 hypertrophy day, right? For every 1 power day. If you're a bodybuilder, you might do 2 hypertrophy days for every 1 strength day. Or you might do a traditional hypertrophy. You might do a blood flow restriction, and then you might do a strength. Power is probably not going to be necessary for a bodybuilder. So those are things that we want to know. That you want to know. Daily undulating periodization works, but it's far from perfected. So practical applications: not varying training style or continually training for either power, hypertrophy, or strength will result in overtraining and staleness. So an individual should periodize their training. If an individual is untrained or perhaps only has 1 large competition per year, traditional periodization for a macro cycle may be beneficial. If an athlete is trained or has multiple competitions per year, then traditional periodization will not be optimal, and the athlete should opt to vary workouts weekly or even daily. Thank you.